Welcome to the Cost of Everything podcast. This week, and for the next few episodes, we are all about the movies. I interview Stephen Follows, expert in films, producer, and all-round data buff. This week, we cover budgeting the movie, and Stephen gives us an insight into some things you wouldn't expect about budgeting a movie. Here is the interview with Stephen. Thank you, Stephen, for joining me today. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast to talk about all things film and the cost of film. So I guess, first of all, who are you? Can you give the listeners an idea of your background?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for inviting me. My name's Stephen. I've got a background as a producer, so I've made plenty of films and productions of different kinds. I have a little production company based in Somerset House. And at the same time, I've also been a data analyst in the film industry for a long time. And so I make films, but I also research trends and patterns and what works and things in the industry. And I try and look at things that the sort of commercial data world might not look at because there's no strong commercial imperative to do so, or because they're just not looking. So I tend to study unusual things, such as, I've done important things like gender inequality in film, but also whether Die Hard's a Christmas movie or not. There is quite a lot of data you can dig into to try and tick. And I won't give the listeners any spoilers, but if you are interested as to whether, or even if you have a strong opinion as to whether Die Hard is officially a Christmas movie or not, I highly recommend you Google it or use the links in this podcast, and you can see just how far you can go with data to try and answer a silly but important question.
That sounds awesome. And I have my own opinions on whether Die Hard's a Christmas movie, but I'll keep them to myself. But know that, it's going to be a really fascinating talk because I think a lot of people go to see a movie and look at costs from everything from the ticket price to, I wonder how much it costs to do that massive explosion. The main starting point, I guess, for me is how do you start pulling together a budget for a movie? So what's the process of going about getting a movie made, and how early in that process does a budget even appear?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. It is interesting when you talk about going to the cinema because you pay the same ticket price, give or take, maybe a few quid different, but essentially you pay the same ticket price no matter how much the movie cost. And that's unusual. Like if you buy clothes or food or an experience, you expect to spend more and get a more expensive product. Or if you spend less, you expect to get a cheaper product. But if you have two choices, you can see the new Bond film or some independent art house film, the Odeon are going to charge you a very similar, if not identical price. And so that's kind of interesting that there is already a disconnect between what we pay and what it costs to produce. So as for when you're thinking about, when you're starting the process of making a film, it's worth saying that, Hollywood and independent films and independent artists and stuff all have different routes. So I'm going to have to generalize a little bit just because of the detail, and I'll focus more on Hollywood. But there's sort of two directions you have to come at the budget from. The first is what will it cost to shoot this script? But secondly, you have to say, what will the market wear? Because most films could be shot on a massive range of budgets. You could have fewer explosions, smaller explosions, or you could just really go to town and have expensive actors and things. So on the one hand, you're thinking, okay, so this film happens in 5 countries. Are we going to go to those countries? Or are we going to pretend, and shoot in Croydon and pretend it's Kabul, or whatever? Or are we going to go? And so you can start from a practical perspective and breaking it down. Well, we need to be there for this long and this many people, and you can do the maths that way. But you also can come to it from the other end and say, okay, well, this film is likely to generate this amount of box office or this amount of sales on iTunes or whatever. Or if you're Netflix, you might say, we're making this film, or we know, or we think this many people will look at it, and our maths tells us that each subscriber is worth X amount per view, or however the internal metrics they use. And then you can work backwards from there. And so you sort of start with an understanding of the marketplace. Films like this tend to cost this. Next Christopher Nolan film is going to be expensive. I don't know exactly how much, but it's not going to be cheap. And then you sort of work towards a budget. And then you have this sort of third thing that doesn't come up until a bit later on, which is, can I actually raise this money? If you're Netflix, you're fine for cash, or Disney or whomever. But if you're an independent producer, you've got to go out and convince investors to put money in because you have to make it first before you can sell it in most cases. So then you might say this script should be made for $10 million and the market will, probably, if this is a good film, work at $10 million, but I can't raise $10 million. So how do I do that? Do I raise a little bit, shoot a little bit, and show people? Do I try and make it for 5? Does that undermine the value of the project because I had to drop, I don't know, Johnny Depp off the list? Maybe a bad example in recent years, but I had to drop my famous actor because that's the only way I can go from 10 to 5 without there being a problem. And then how does that change my economics? So producers are doing things from multiple different directions, and it's a constantly evolving process. It doesn't really, it doesn't fully lock until you finish the film, but it doesn't start to lock down until you start signing contracts. You're raising 10 million and the person owns 100% of the profits. You can't raise another million because you've got nothing to exchange for it. So it starts incredibly nebulous, slowly becomes more real. The real world comes in and gives you bad news. And then eventually you look back and go, oh yeah, it was 9.7. Who knew?
I guess everything really starts with a bit of a analysis on whether it's going to make money, because then that determines whether you're going to attract anyone who's actually going to invest in the project. If you haven't got the money yourself, I guess, like you said, places like Netflix, which are a bit cash rich, are really just trying to spread or put their fingers in as many pies as possible, and then just see what works and develop their own. Well, I don't know how you would define what they're trying to do, but just trying to build their own base, and therefore they don't really have that much. They'll do all the analysis, but because they're cash rich, they don't need to worry about generating an interest to get as many investors on board as possible. And then it's quite interesting that a lot of metrics are using historic performance to try and say this is how much we think it's going to make. But then a lot of that is driven by a lot of uncertainty, because then you're worried about the taste, the different demographics you're trying to hit. So it's quite interesting there. And then the different types of financing, I mean, I can't even get my head around, because I always hear, and when you see people thanking like the producers and the different studios and all this, that, and the other. I mean, how are films financed in different ways? If we take I know there's a whole suite of ways this is probably done, but from my perspective, it's not as simple as trying to get a studio to buy into a film and then them providing the money and then you just go away and shoot it, right?
Well, I mean, it can be, but there are people who have that track record and those connections and trust. For example, if somebody came off the street and said, "Can I borrow £5?" The answer is no. But if your best friend did, you just say yes. You wouldn't even ask why. So there is a certain level of familiarity that will grease the wheels. But it is worth saying that every film is a prototype. Every single film has its own journey, and that's not a sort of an asinine statement. It really is true. Like you really can't, there are some generalizations and some patterns, but there isn't a standard model, and that is partly by design and partly just because of the deeper truth in the film industry is that supply and demand is kind of strange. With independent film, the supply and demand is there's almost no demand and there's huge amounts of supply because people want to make films. They want their script to be made. They want to direct a film. They want to produce a film. They enjoy doing it. They push most art on the low level is pushed into the market, which is absolutely fine. That's I have no problem with that. That it exists. Its own reason for existing is that it is art. That's fine. But it's interesting when you start bringing it into the marketplace and saying, okay, well, how am I going to get the money for that? The studios are making films. I mean, basically, the studios want to sell films, so they have to make them. Independent filmmakers want to make them, so they have to sell them. And so that shifts a little bit the priorities. Disney needs product. Disney needs a certain number of films coming out every year so that they've got the money from the films, but also so they've got clothes to make, Broadway shows to open, things to base their rides on. And so they need product. But that still doesn't create a standard model for how these things happen. And you'd be surprised how many of the studio films are actually underwritten by investors, because they don't want. It's a huge risk to make a film. There's a massive amount of uncertainty with studio films. There's so much money at play. If you think about Disney's biggest films costing, I don't know, 150, 200 million, it's a ballpark. Some can be above, some can be below. But if you're in the process of making 6 or 7 of them, which would only be maybe a year and a half's worth of releases, you're close to $1 billion in play that you're not earning any interest on. That if you have 6 bad directors or bad writers or bad actors or actors that turn out to be involved in some sort of scandal, you won't get most of that money back. But conversely, you might accidentally create the next or deliberately create the next Frozen or Lion King and create a franchise that lasts 4 decades. So there is a massive amount of risk. And I think I have a personal belief that almost nobody in the film industry is genuinely motivated by money, because if they were, they wouldn't be in the industry.
Right. There's easier ways of making money.
Totally. Like, there, almost no job in the film industry is better than the alternative outside the industry if you didn't care about film. So for the makeup artists, they can work 9 to 5 in a salon down the road from their house and get Christmas tips and holiday time and get paid well, or they can go at 4 a.m. and be there for 16 hours in a muddy field with job uncertainty and no tips at Christmas. But they love movies, and so they do it from passion and from art, and that's awesome. And it's the same in finance. People in finance like to believe that they're there just objectively, but to be honest, anyone who comes into the film industry purely to make money is either not paying attention or is going to leave pretty quickly. There's an old saying in the film industry that the way to make a small fortune in the film industry is to start with a large fortune. And it's very true in the sense that lots of money moves around, but very little settles. And a lot of it ends up in lawsuits, or you don't see many repeat investors in the film industry. Not necessarily because they've all been scammed, but because, to be honest, once the novelty's worn off, if you want to grow your money by 5% without risk, or whatever the metrics are that you want, film is absolutely not the way to do it. But if you like supporting the opera, or you want to play golf or buy a lottery ticket, and then suddenly funding a film that might go to Cannes, and you get to say, "Oh, my film's at the Cannes Film Festival," then that suddenly seems a lot more attractive.
Right. So, I mean, that's quite interesting. The whole motivation for producing a film or for investing in it. I think you're right. It is sort of like the only way that I kind of think about it as well, from my simple way of thinking about it, is like wanting to own a football team.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, that's a really good analogy.
And you just you're doing it partly because you can say, "Oh, I've got a football team," and then after a while, it just becomes a bit of a drag if things aren't going your way, because there's, like you say, there's no guarantees, and it also like the whole if you're already rich, that's when you're gonna get into movies. I guess that's why Amazon came into the market, Apple came into the market.
They don't have to play by the same rules as everyone else, right? So instantly they can do really well because they are more nakedly focused on what they're actually focused on. Amazon is trying to get legitimacy. The last couple of years, Netflix has been trying to get Oscars, and they've just had a film that's opened the London Film Festival. That's more important to them than, because they can't literally trace how much money they get back from each individual bit of content. They can track how many people watched it, but even all the metrics in the world won't tell you how important one project was. But they'll see it as a slate. If they make X number of movies or TV series over a year, they'll probably get Y number of subscribers, and that makes sense. And that's fundamentally different to the model that most studios have worked in the past, which has been film to film, or in Disney's case, franchise to franchise. But Netflix and Amazon and Apple are working on a completely different model. And that's really fascinating to see, because we're still only seeing the beginnings of the effects of that.
I guess a question I've got from your knowledge, how has the motivation to make a film changed over time? Because I guess if you see a lot of interviews and people complaining about the kind of films that get made nowadays versus the amazing productions in the past that would never get made nowadays, because there's no guarantee of making a return on some of these things, but they turned out to be great movies. And to what extent is that a load of hindsight bias, with people just looking back and just saying, "Oh, the glory days," as people tend to do?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you have to appreciate it's an industry of storytellers. Nobody runs away to manage the circus. Everyone who's in the film industry has done so to varying degrees because they love it and they want to get involved in it. And the industry selects, trains, and rewards people who are very good at telling the narrative, telling a convincing narrative. This is not to imply anything to do with untruth. I think these people believe this. But my point is, there's very little feedback. If you go into finance and you say, "I did great yesterday," someone else can verify that. And certainly in the long term, there's very few places to hide. Whereas you can make an entire career in film not succeeding financially, but still having a very successful, happy career and people around you being very happy. I mean, if you look at Woody Allen, very, very few of his films have made money, but he's a consistent filmmaker until recent years. But so it is the motivations for why you want to get into it. And there was a really interesting case study where when the apparently North Koreans, but I don't know, hacked Sony Pictures. They dumped a load and load of emails and a load of internal documents a few years ago, and they're all available actually there's a WikiLeaks sort of microsite for that. But there was a journalist who went through them all and sort of wrote up a book called The Big Picture, which I highly recommend. And one of the things that he talks about in the book is the journey of how the film Steve Jobs got made, which is the Michael Fassbender book about Steve Jobs. Or is it called Jobs? I can't remember. But basically, the internal models that they did, the predictions of how much this film would make, kept proving, quote unquote, that it wouldn't be financially viable. It was too expensive, and they didn't have a famous enough name in it, and it wasn't a broad enough appeal. But Amy Pascal, who ran the studio, really wanted to make the film because she believed it would be a great film. And I think it is a good film, and the acting's great. As a piece of art, it's great. And she was right to see that. But she kept going back to her people saying, well, how about we change this? How about we change that? And in the end, the film got made and did exactly what everyone expected. But she wasn't fired for that. She wasn't told off for that. It's not the greatest outcome in the world, but it's not the end of the world because it was an interesting film, and it also, I think it did reasonably well critically and things like that. And so there is a good little case study, and she's by no means special. I don't wish to single her out. It's just we have an unusual window into that because we have all those emails. But there is an example of how films get made at the highest possible level. And the data is saying don't, but the artistic side, the desire is yes. And so it gets made. So it's a lot more, I wouldn't say chaotic, but it's not as ordered as you might think. And what it takes to get ahead as a person in the industry, as a studio or whatever, is not just about making money. It's about convincing people around you that you've done the right thing. And also, art can't be measured in numbers. You can look for numbers like how much the critics gave it or whatever, but fundamentally, you're never going to be able to nail that down. And so that creates a perpetual sense of uncertainty. And talking about hindsight bias, I mean, there's a fascinating book, again, by David Putnam called The Undeclared War, talking about the history of the UK and US film industries. And there's a fascinating bit from, I think it must be about 100 years ago, where an MP in Parliament stood up and complained about all these American movies coming over here, bringing their culture over here, squeezing out British productions. And it could have been said yesterday. And I have a growing suspicion that we are in a perpetual falling state. This is, I mean, the British film industry, I mean, investors generally, I mean, studios, I mean, everything has its own perpetual falling state of thinking that everything is about to collapse. We're in the last days of Rome, but actually that is its own stasis, and I think that when you look back to previous eras, you cherry pick, and it's very easy to pick an entire decade and pick 4 films and prove. I'm sure it's the same for music as well. Music was better back in the insert decade here. And it's certainly the case in film where the stasis for film is that they, on average, overall, don't make enough money, are too uncertain, and are too massively risky, but get made nonetheless. And I think that's true in the studio system as much as it is in the independent system, is that it never makes sense, but it still happens.
Yeah.
I love that.
So just talking about sort of the uncertainty and the fact that there are a lot of assumptions that go into this, I guess it's rather than why they're made, it's like who tends to create the budget. Is it consistently the same people who, in the early stages of setting the budget for a proposed film, who tends to create that budget? And then, I guess you've sort of answered this question, but how much of that is the truth? How much of it is based on truth, and how much of it is major assumptions, be they optimistic or intentionally sort of uncertain and based on, just a finger in the air? Hope.
I mean, we can talk about the essential nature of truth and can we ever know anything, but I'll be a bit more specific than that. So in answer to your first question, so fundamentally the main person or people that run a film are the producers. And you can think of them as, if there's one person, you can think of them like the CEO. The director is in charge of the creative vision, but the producer is in charge of the overall production. And so it's different, as if every film's a prototype, but generally the producer is in charge of making it happen and is essentially the director's boss. But at the same time, directors are so key to the film that it's not really fair to say they work for the producer, even if that might technically be true. It's more on most productions. And there's a lot of overlap as well. A lot of producers can be directors. You also can have lots of types of producers, and you can have 30 people listed as producer. There's no union protection for credits. But operationally, there'll tend to be one or a small number of people who are in charge of the production. if they're working for if the film is being funded by a studio, then there'll be a studio boss or studio staff that will oversee it, and so there's a bit of a relationship. But you can think of that like a client supplier relationship to some degree. So fundamentally, you've got the producer who's, or let's just say it's one producer for the sake of this, and so let's say she's in charge of the production. She's at the hub of all of it. She will have a sense of how much this film will cost from her experience. She'll have a sense of how much the film will be valuable because of her experience in the market. But she will be looking for clues and have experts helping her. So on those two sides we talked about, which was how much it actually costs to make on a physical basis, and then on the other hand, how much we can get to sell it. So on the physical basis, she'll have a line producer who is the person who is only in charge of taking a script to the moment when you've finished filming all the scenes. So you haven't edited any of it. That's post-production. That happens afterwards. But they've got specific scripts. You wouldn't bring a line producer on board when you say, I've got an idea for a horror film about an alien. Like, they can't do anything yet because they're like, well, I don't know what this is. But when you have a first draft of a script or maybe an outline, but probably you have a script, they can go, oh, okay, well, I can see how many days of filming that might be. And they'll do all the math and they'll sit down for a few weeks and break down different schedules and different ways of approaching it. And then you end up with some budgets there. And then the other half of the producing job is the we talked about with sales. They'll have sales agents who, for the independent world, you get one sales agent for each film, and they go out to each different distributor in each country, who are the people that supply it to TV channels and cinemas and things. And the sales agent will say, well, we've just sold 3 films very similar to this, and they went for this much, or I know that this particular Brazilian buyer is interested or not interested. And so from there, they may create sales estimates. At a studio, this will happen internally because they have their own offices around the world and they've sold their own films. But the process is the same. These are recent deals. This is how much money came in. We feel it's going to go here. So here's our estimates. This actor is particularly famous. Maybe they're particularly famous in that country. Big in Japan is, a sort of almost a meme. The idea that's how people like Jeremy Irons got a lot of their work, was because they were more famous in some places than others.
Right.
But so the producer is trying to weigh up those two sets of inputs, the physical cost and the options within that, the estimates for sales and also how much they believe them or how much they're likely. And then only the producer really can do that third part we talked about, which is, well, can I actually raise this? There's no point having a $10 million film that you're absolutely certain will make $10 million if you can't get $10 million to do it, catch 22. So that's where the producer will have advisors and supporters, but fundamentally where they often shine is they're like, okay, so I can make a really good case to this person. I can get 2 million from this person. If we shoot in Monaco, I'll get a tax credit, so that'll give me an extra 2 million or whatever. And then I'll do some of those deals, like the Brazilian distributor who's really interested in the idea of my movie. I'll sell it to them now before I've even made it for a discount, but at least I'll get the money up front, or at least a promise that I can exchange at the bank for money. And so they piecemeal all these budgets together. And film funding comes from so many different places and so many different terms and conditions. Some money you don't have to pay back, some you do, some might have a interest, some might be paid back before others. And so the producer puts that patchwork together and hopes that it all works, and hopes that no one pulls out, that if you're doing it in different countries, even the exchange rates changing can have a massive effect.
Yeah.
And so they try and pull that together, and then they try and get the cash and get it all done at the same time, and then shoot. And then when it's shot, it becomes, I wouldn't say easier, but more straightforward, because you can actually show someone an edit. You can say, look, this is the film. But yeah, so it's that they have all sorts of people helping them and advising them, and then they've got to make the rubber hit the road and actually turn that into real cash in the bank.
So it's quite interesting that a lot of the early budget or understanding how much things cost is the expertise of people in the industry, their knowledge, rather than any sort of hard numbers or facts. And I guess there is a point where it does become about the hard numbers. And so generally, do you find that most of the film is made before a realistic budget is actually done? And you also mentioned sort of making the case to the right people, so selling to them. And as funders, is there a point where they start asking questions, and how involved do they get then in terms of saying, well, give me the real numbers now. I want to know how well or badly we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, you've hit some really key elements there. So on the second point, because it's in the forefront of my mind. I mean, I get questions a lot from independent filmmakers who are starting out in film, and they're like, "Okay, so how much is my film worth? Like, how do I go and figure that out?" And the real answer is you'll never know. Even when you've sold it, you won't quite know if it was a good deal or a bad deal, and that is really unsettling, and explains a lot why there's a huge churn in the film industry. Very few repeat investors. 4 out of 5 filmmakers never make a second film. There is a huge churn because it's not really systematized in a way that allows you to learn it, come in. So on the second part of the question for you, it's like, well, you don't really know, and how much investors get involved in is both. The answer is too little and too much, because too little would be people who just are trusting the producer and are just like, oh, they seem to know what they're doing, and I'm excited, and I get a tax break, and I get to go to the premiere, and here's some money, and they don't interrogate it. If on the other hand, there can be too much involvement, where they also want their significant other to be an actor or an actress in the movie. They want to change something, and ultimately, there's the golden rule: he who has the gold makes the rules. And so, if the investor who's giving you half your money says, "My niece would like a role," their niece is getting a role, because the producer is doing whatever they can to get the cash, trying to make as few compromises as possible, artistic, moral, whatever. But going back to the first part of your question, so the line producer who's putting together a budget, it'll always be a specific budget in the sense that it's always broken down. It can be in Excel, but it's not. It tends to be in a programs like this one called Movie Magic budgeting. So it tends to be in a specific program, but fundamentally it's a spreadsheet. And they're not just guessing. I mean, you could read a script and get a sense, but really, like, there's some devil's in the detail. And movies are physical productions. They take lots of people to physical places, and you have to build things and buy things. And so there's a lot of math going on there, where you're trying to multiply up however many days by how many people. And so they'll take a script and they'll break it all down. They'll break down every scene, and they'll look at who's in the scene and what's in the scene. And they may get quotes about how much it costs to build this spaceship that no one's built before, this set. Could they do it? They might get a quote from a visual effects house to see whether they could do it with a green screen, or they'll get a quote from a physical special effects house of how much it would cost to build it. But they get closer and closer into the detail. That's where their experience really helps, when there's a unique problem. But most of the costs are not unique, in the sense that there are union rates for lots of crew members. Certainly in America, it's a lot more unionized than elsewhere. And then there's just physical things. It costs this amount to put someone up in a hotel, pretty much, unless it's, they're really famous and you want a pricey one, or it's a cheap area. But you then multiply that by, we're filming for 3 months and we've got a crew of 100. That's just maths there. You haven't got a lot of space. All you can do is shoot for less or have fewer people. So it's a mix of the more unique the problem, the more it relies on their contacts and their experience. But the more it's a physical size scale based thing, then it's just putting all these numbers into the right spreadsheets, seeing what they come out with, and then being appalled at how high it is, and going back and trying to be creative. The job of a line producer and a producer when it comes to reducing a budget is incredibly creative. What if we film those 2 scenes at the same time or on the same day? We can save, a trip here. Or can we shoot in Scotland, but the film's set in Scotland, but we're going to shoot it in Luxembourg because it looks similar, and we'll just do 1 day of shooting in Scotland with all the landmarks in the background and no one will notice. So there's a lot of that creative work that has to go in. And that's, again, where the experience and skill comes in, where they're like, what, it doesn't work. Or, I know Luxembourg seems cheaper on paper, but you've forgotten to take into account that we lose this investor if we don't shoot it in Scotland, or whatever the thing might be. So yeah, every level is a mix of truth and math and numbers. And on the other hand, experience, intuition, guessing, optimism, or pessimism, depending on experience, I guess.
A mix of the two. And I sort of early on in sort of you answering the question about, the little or too much involvement and, the motives of the investor. You just reminded me of something I heard about, was it Monty Python's Life of Brian, that no one wanted to touch it. No one was going to, they were pretty much going to can it. And then, was it Ringo Starr or something? They asked Ringo Starr, and he just said, yeah, I'll invest in it just because I want to see the movie.
Yeah, it might be George Harrison. I can't remember who it is, but you're absolutely right. It's a very famous pop star. And but that's where a lot of movies happen. And you could make an argument that the most interesting arty films are the biggest risk, because part of what's interesting about a movie is that it's new and fresh and different. And so therefore, you could argue that it's more likely that you need a benefactor. I mean, it's the same reason that there's all those beautiful paintings in Italy, because you needed the system of patronage, because you couldn't just do the industrial side. And the studios are the most industrial part of it, and they make perhaps the least brave and interesting work on an artistic level compared to the most artistic films coming out of the independent sector. So I actually don't mind that. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure as long as everyone was honest about it and they got what they wanted out of it. I mean, that's a good example, because I'm sure he's made a profit on it, quite a significant one over time. But it's ultimately, they knew what they were doing. They knew that he was like, I have spare money. You know, I could buy a yacht. I could get my name on an opera seat. I could, donate to a museum, or I can invest in a film that might bring some money back. But fundamentally, I think I want this film to exist. I think this art should happen. And that's awesome. That's probably more honest than saying I guarantee you a 17% return over 2 years, because you just can't know.
And then it kind of links to the motive, the sort of the creator of it as well. So just from an art perspective, or I don't know whether it's from a self-preservation perspective as well, because then again, sort of I've heard sort of Rocky, and how Sylvester Stallone wrote the screenplay and then was trying to take it around to studios who were willing to buy it but wouldn't cast him in it.
Mm-hmm.
And he wanted to play the character because he was like, I wrote this because it's me.
Yeah.
And how he had to basically pretty much sell everything and sold his dog and all this other stuff. Just the actual producers of the film in the end sort of remortgaged their house to produce it, but they allowed him to be in the film, and then it turned into this big, massive success.
Yeah, stories like that abound in the industry, and I have no reason to think any of it's not true. Obviously, some of the details might be not here and there, but fundamentally, at its core, that's a very familiar pattern. And I think that it's tricky because, on the one hand, it's true that it's an inspiring story about sticking to what you believe. Also, rejection doesn't mean that you're wrong. It just means those people haven't seen it or aren't going to believe in you. But on the other hand, we don't know how many stories of people who sold their dog and didn't get the film made. And so there is this sort of reinforcing. It's an industry of storytellers, and we tell the stories we want to hear and the stories that want to be heard. And so I always worry about what we're doing. I think it's the same with actors or actresses, like this person was discovered in a mall and now she's like 23 and the richest woman in whatever. It's like true, but there might also be 50,000 other people who are going through horrible experiences. And I don't want to crush anyone's dreams. I want them to know the odds and still choose to do it. It's not stupid to play the lottery if you understand it's a lottery. It's stupid to play the lottery if you think it's a bank or an investment.
I think you're right, and just to take it all, they are all storytellers, and so it can get quite apocryphal. So it's quite interesting, and you don't tend to hear the abject failures as much, because no one wants to hear that story. Everyone wants a good news. Well, I guess some people like the bad news stories, but in this kind, you kind of want to hear about successes, don't you?
Well, I think Bo Burnham, I remember hearing him interviewed on some panel, some interview show where he said, follow your dreams, but at the same time, don't listen to me. I've just won the Powerball and I'm saying liquidate all your assets, buy lottery tickets. You know what I mean? Like, be careful who you listen to. It's not wrong. It's just not the full picture.
On the next episode, the movie goes into production. What costs are there? What tends to go wrong? And what are the cost drivers when making that movie? Until then, thanks for listening and have a great week.